Our nation's small businesses are facing unprecedented economic disruption due to the coronavirus outbreak. The coronavirus has had a catastrophic impact on Americans who are no longer working. The Fed, also known as the Federal Reserve, they came swooping in to save the day, but we can now see their alternate motives as low income received no support and big banks are profiting. The economic relief through the stimulus, it was supposed to help the hardest hit. Instead, it helped those businesses that would help the banks manage the loans, make the most money. Data shows that a majority of the relief is going to white male business owners and less to women and minorities. However, it's not about race or discrimination, it's about greed and wealth. The big banks, they follow the money. Is it possible that the big banks saw this as an opportunity to make money? Prior to many of the executive orders of keeping us at home, the big banks were already making plans. You see, as the government began to shut down the economy and continued to prepare, the banks were ready to receive the bushels of money from the Federal Reserve to help the unemployed Americans. So on Friday, March 27, 2020, the president signed into law the CARES Act, which contained like $376 billion in relief for American workers and small businesses in hopes to reduce the impact of the government's choice to shut down the country. The CARES Act was intended to work for all Americans and was supposed to place emphasis on the areas that had been hardest hit. But once the government added more to the national debt and allowed the Federal Reserve to provide billions of dollars to the banks, and the banks now had control of this money, the much needed loans did not go to those that needed it the most. So many minorities in the hardest hit areas were missing out. Both women, both racial minorities, and rural business owners were not receiving this desperately needed loan. The map on the left, it demonstrates the hardest hit by the coronavirus, and the image on the right shows the areas that received the largest amount of economic relief. Funds did not flow to the areas hardest hit by the coronavirus that needed this economic relief. It went to wealthy businesses that already had enough money probably to pay their employees. So look at this graph. It depicts the loan distribution amounts. Looking at the bottom left graph, we see that the loans of more than $1 million made up just 5% of the applicants who were approved the first round. But it accounted for roughly half of all of the money. Can you believe that? Half of the relief money was sucked up through just 5% of the loans. These loans first favored large companies that were seeking greater sums. However, what was immediately noticed was the demographical disparities between the distribution of these loans. So as usual, the highly biased ACLU, they began to scream racism, jumping to conclusion without applying a bias-free critical analysis of the facts. So now it was obvious that minorities were not benefiting from this economic relief as much as a white male business owner. And even though this relief, it was promised to go to those that were hardest hit. Now let's look at a few other variables. Here are these two maps again. The one on the left depicting the areas hardest hit, represented in darker shades. The one on the right depicting areas that received the greatest amount of economic relief for small businesses. Now look at the map at the bottom. We see another key variable. Not only did the economic relief not go to the areas hit the hardest by coronavirus, but look at another feature of each of the states where the money went. The loans flowed into areas that have a lower poverty level. This relief is a government fund that was appropriated by Congress to help those that are feeling a greater impact of coronavirus. This relief adds more to the national debt. All of us will pay towards his debt through a higher taxation. This money has been entrusted to the big banks, and it is being given to those that probably could have survived without the relief, while those that need it are continuing to suffer. Now this next map, added to the other three maps, we can show another distinct variable of who is benefiting from the economic relief. These four maps demonstrate that not only is the economic relief not going to the areas hardest hit by the coronavirus and not benefiting the states with higher poverty rates, but more of the relief loans are going to states with a higher white population. No wonder the ACLU is immediately claiming racial inequality. However, if we analyze deeper, we can see that this isn't about race or preventing minorities to rise above their current class, but it is more about where the banks can make the most money. Now, historical racist government policies have led states with higher white population to be the areas where more money can be made. And this is due to some historical examples of discriminating policies. For example, the denying of GI Bill to African Americans after World War II. The Southern Democrats, they feared that the GI Bill would help the advancement of African Americans. And then on top of that, the post-war housing loans, they were denied to African Americans, especially when applying for a loan in rich white communities. Even today, politicians try and demonstrate their support to African Americans, but this support is only seen among very few in urban wide areas, keeping African Americans poor and maintaining them below that poverty level. And so we can deduce that historical policies and the lack of government assistance have led minorities to stay in these areas of higher poverty, where today there's a higher impact of the coronavirus and where there are less white people. However, today the big banks, they don't care about race. To them, it's about making more money. To them, it's about wealth and greed. Providing loans where they can make the most money just happens to be in the states with a higher population. But the Fed doesn't want you to focus on this. They claim that they are here to save the economy. But what they did is give almost half the economic support to 5% of the applicants who received over $1 million. Can you believe that? Can you imagine how big of a company would need $1 million in relief? I bet a company like this probably has enough money saved up that they don't need the assistance. They could have paid their employees anyway. The banks, they hooked their buddies up. Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, and US Bank, they all concealed from the public that they were prioritizing applications that would make the banks the most money. Thousands of small businesses were left with no relief as the money dried up fast. As these poor continued to suffer with no relief, these big banks, they were happier than pigs in manure. And as MIT economists have stated, this program, it functioned less as a social insurance for the hardest hit areas and more as a cash infusion for these less affected businesses. These banks, they concealed from the public that it was reshuffling the priority of these applications. Many small businesses, they missed out on the first round of loans because this money, it dried up fast. But the Federal Reserve, they claim that they're here to save the day, which they claim, as seen on their website, to have the responsibility of stabilizing the economy by loaning the government money when it runs out. The Federal Reserve, if you know the history of it, it came to pass after many rich bankers felt that there needs to be a central bank used to help stabilize the economy and to help loan the government money when they run into natural disasters or economic strain or anything that requires more money given to the government when they can't afford to pay their bills. This whole idea was all thought of many years ago on a place called Jekyll Island in Georgia, where all of the richest bankers in the U.S. got together, came up with an idea. Let's find a way to help the government out, but at the same time, we can make a lot of money. And that is exactly what happened. They created the Federal Reserve, and now we are borrowing billions of dollars, not only from the Federal Reserve, but we are borrowing money from other corporations all around the world. As we can see on this graph, this is who we currently owe money to. People all over the world, they thrive off of wars, off of natural disasters, off of anything that causes the government to go further in debt to help provide relief. And we have seen this multiple times. Now, if wars seem to end and there is nothing to influence the population, a suitable substitute for war must be found. And it must elicit the same reaction. That is what the coronavirus has done. We accept the assistance that many corporations are providing to the American people, but do you realize that this money is coming from the Federal Reserve and all these other organizations? They have injected billions of dollars, which is going straight to the banks, which is increasing our national debt. And who pays for this debt? We do, through a higher taxation. But as Americans, we are blind. We say, thank you, Federal Reserve. Thank you, all these people. Thank you, Bank of America. But they don't realize that we've just gone deeper in debt, which will result in higher taxation. Minorities continue to suffer. Big banks like JP Morgan make a lot of money. Now we are back to opening up the economy, slowly going back to the way things are. But do you realize the number of coronavirus cases continue to rise? Nothing's different than from what it was like a couple months ago. But guess what? The Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, they've all got their paycheck. It's good to go. Now let's influence the government to open the economy back up. We got our money. We were successful. Now everything's fine. Let's go back to normal. But things have not gone back to normal. The smaller businesses are suffering, going into poverty, while the rich businesses, the large corporations, continue to make more. And this is exactly what they hope for with the coronavirus. For the government to rely on the Federal Reserve to provide more money to give to the banks to manage, who then in turn, they could give it to their buddies and other large businesses to make a profit. We can see this happen all the time. If we just look at the amount of net worth of JP Morgan over the years, we can see how he spikes more when there's world events that are occurring where the government needs to borrow money. And look here recently. We can see in the world that we're pulling out of Syria, Iraq is kind of tapering down, Afghanistan. And as we can see, JP Morgan, their net worth starts to drop, so they need to find a way to make more money. And they can find that way to elicit fear through the coronavirus. And that's how they've been able to manipulate the government to rely on the Federal Reserve to give the banks money, so they can then, in return, give money to the larger corporations while the poor continue to suffer. Well, the poor have suffered enough. And it is now time that these big banks need to pay back the suffering that they have caused. All of these small businesses that have been denied when they tried to reach out for money, that did not get the money because it was sucked up quickly by all the friends of these big banks. These individuals need to be paid, and I believe that these big banks are the ones that should pay it, because they had robbed this entrusted government money from the government, and they have passed it to their buddies when it should have went to those that are suffering from the government's decision to shut down our country.